Well, hey there, you're listening to the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host Scott Crockett and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. And we're back with BCA's economics team with a fresh update on Alberta's economy. After nearly a decade of struggling economically, is Alberta making a comeback? Many signs point to this. Commodity prices are high, revenues flowing into the province, people are moving here, employment is strong, and the economy is on track to be the biggest it has ever been. But not everything is sunshine and rainbows. Albertans are still struggling to meet needs with rising inflation and lower wage growth. Labor challenges are still a concern for businesses, and there might be a mild recession on the way. Mike Holden and Alicia Planincic break down all these ideas and discuss what they mean for Albertans. Mike, Alicia, thanks for joining us again to talk economic update. And we're recording this episode just a couple days after the Calgary Stampede. And, I've lived in Calgary for a good chunk of my life. And I don't know, there's just something about this last Stampede. It felt very energetic, very optimistic. And there might actually be some economic reasons behind that. And we're going to go into that. We just put out an update, Alberta's economy for summer 2022. So give us the headline of what's going on in Alberta's economy over the past quarter.
Thanks, Britt. Well, you're right. It's, with the Stampede just having ended here in Calgary, it was a remarkable change of scenery over the last couple of years, between COVID impacts and the struggling economy, not just in the last couple of years, but for like 5 years before that. It does feel very different. And like you said, there are numbers to back it up. We have, employment growth in the province has been strong. We're seeing, over the last 3 or 4 months, Alberta's gained about 45,000 jobs, and across Canada, it's only been about 12. So it's been, there's been more job growth here. Most of those jobs have tended to be in the private sector. The province is benefiting from high commodity prices in the oil and gas sector and in the agriculture sector. And so we have all of these tailwinds behind us. And, most economists think that Alberta is going to be leading the country in the next couple of years and in terms of economic growth. And, so there's all those positives. And then, of course, at the same time, we wouldn't be economists if there wasn't always an on the other hand, which, there
Naturally.
Yeah.
The old saying about how we need more one-handed economists, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so, nothing is ever unambiguously good or unambiguously bad. And in this case, of course, the big, the cloud looming over us all, of course, is inflation. And, we're seeing inflation rates increase, into levels that we haven't seen in decades. And that's causing the Bank of Canada to start raising interest rates pretty aggressively. We just saw a 1% hike earlier, or a week or two ago. And, that threatens to derail the kind of economic growth we've got so far. So in a nutshell, it's things are going very well now. There are some clouds on the horizon.
Right. And we're going to talk about all three of those major things that you brought up. Let's start with employment. What's happening there? You mentioned some good news.
Yeah, I think the most exciting thing to me with this update is it's the first time that we've really seen Alberta has not only caught up with other provinces in recovery, but I think as far as a lot of indicators go, we actually might already be in a stronger position than other provinces. And this is definitely playing out in the labor market. So we're seeing a huge improvement versus where we were at pre-COVID in 2019. To see an unemployment rate of less than 5% is pretty remarkable, right? When we went into the pandemic with an unemployment rate of 7.5%. So this is a really huge improvement. And the best news here is it's not just, certain industries or certain groups of people, it's really broad-based. So when we look at, who is benefiting from these employment gains, it's really across the board, all ages, men and women, and across a really wide variety of industries. So it's not just those industries that were hard hit from the pandemic, like restaurants and stores, retail shops. And it's also not just resource industries. It's really a broad range of industries that are seeing growth. So overall, really good news story. And I think the most exciting thing for us, something that we've been really worried about for a while now, is finally seeing long-term unemployment decline. So this was the number of folks who are out of work, not just for a month or two, right, but for a full year looking for work actively. So a really big, not just economic, but social challenge for Albertans. And so to finally see that number get back more in line with where we were before the pandemic is really, really encouraging.
I'm going to channel my inner economist and go with on the other hand, labor shortages are still a big challenge. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I guess the other hand is that because employment has been so strong, basically, when we survey our member businesses, they're saying even in the midst of uncertainty, most of our businesses want to hire more people. They're very optimistic about the next few months and about business activity and consumer demand. They want to up their staffing, but the challenge is they're running out of folks, that are applying for these positions. So you've got tons of open positions, way more than we were seeing before the pandemic, about double what we were seeing before the pandemic. Now, I think the one thing that's really important to note on the labor shortages is this isn't just an impact of COVID and the pandemic. This is really a longer term transition as our workforce ages. So kind of the one caveat with, different demographic groups is the one group that's really left the labor force is older Albertans. And the same is true across Canada, where we've got, a lot of folks that are simply retiring. And so this is where I think the challenge is not so much short term, but longer term, we need to be thinking about how do we support businesses in, integrating technology and innovation in ways that they don't need such a big labor force, that they can find some productivity gains. So that's something that I see as not just a short-term reality, but a longer-term challenge that we need to think about.
Yeah, and I'd add to that too, or at least complement it a little bit. There's the issue of an aging population is also feeding into some of these labor shortage challenges that we're seeing. So we have, both within Alberta and across Canada, the participation rate, which is, the number of Canadians or Albertans who either have a job or who are actively looking for a job. That number has been steadily declining for years now. And even if you ignore COVID effects, and it's not so much that there are fewer younger people looking for work or even fewer of that sort of core age group of people looking for work. It tends to be fairly heavily concentrated on the older population. So as more people shift into this, 55 plus age category, as Alicia said, they tend to be there are more of them that are going to retire, and fewer of them that are engaged in the workforce, and so that's pushing down growth in the overall labor force. So there are fewer people available to work, and that's one of the reasons why businesses are having an increasingly hard time finding people coming into work.
Right. So that leads me to sort of two labor questions that I wanted to ask you. The first is that 4.9 number really stood out to me because way back when I read economics textbooks, they said that 5% unemployment was sort of considered, quote, full employment. And I wonder if you subscribe to that thinking and if you think that indicates we're likely around full employment. And then the second part of the question is, where did all the people go? This is, I'm hearing this question over and over from business leaders, sometimes even phrased just that simply. And I think you pointed to some of the reasons, but I think we're seeing this quite rapid shortage of labor across nearly every industry. And even though our focus is Alberta, it seems to be largely Canada-wide. And so, you point to something like aging population. That's not something that changes over a period of months. That's a thing that changes over a period of years or even many years. So throw those two on the table for you.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of full employment, there isn't a magic number at which that's the case. I mean, around 5%, it could be around 4, 3.5. The idea behind that full employment number is that the unemployment rate is never going to be zero because there are always people who are in transition from one job to the next.
Right?
Yeah, this is a churn thing. And so the question is, at what point with a lower unemployment rate have you hit that churn point? And, once you hit around 5%, a little bit less than 5%, yeah, I mean, that's when it starts to manifest itself, at least in certain industries. And then, becomes more widespread. And so that's, we're at the point where that's certainly a concern. And, the labor shortage numbers that we've pointed to in this report do bear that out to some degree. There's a huge increase in the number of unfilled jobs across the province and across the country.
And then how about on the where'd everybody go all at once problem?
Yeah, Scott, yeah, I might add just one other thing. So beyond the retirement thing, I think another piece of the puzzle is just workers changing preferences on what type of work they want to do coming out of COVID. So I think, for instance, the travel industry is a really good, very obvious example when you go to the airport and you see that clearly there's not enough staffing at our airports to get the number of consumers who would like to travel through. There's just been this resetting of, do I want to be a pilot? Do I want to go into training school in the midst of a pandemic? Well, probably not, right? And so because we saw these changes in what people were interested in doing over the course of the pandemic, I think slowly and slowly over time that's built up, and all of a sudden we're seeing just totally different preferences among workers as far as what types of work they're interested in, what types of work maybe feel secure, what types of work feel safe. Obviously, I'll add as well, like maybe a preference for opportunities where I can work from home, especially if I was one of those home buyers over the course of the last couple of years and I moved into the suburbs. Now all of a sudden I'm just looking for jobs that are going to allow me to work from home most days a week. So I think that's a part of the picture as well.
Mm-hmm. And then the other piece to this, and this is something we've been tracking for the better part of a year, is inter-provincial migration. And Alberta hasn't always had a positive story, but we've seen a bit of a turnaround there, that we're seeing more people come into the province. Will that help alleviate some of this labor challenges that we're experiencing?
Yeah, I think it will. And, Alberta's always been, generally speaking, has always been a magnet for people moving from other parts of Canada coming in. And that ebbs and flows depending on how well the provincial economy is doing. And, often, what ends up happening is there are a lot of movements between Alberta and BC, for example. So, when the Alberta economy is doing better, a lot of people flood in from BC. And then when the BC economy is doing better, it tends to go the other way around. And then historically speaking, we've tended to see a movement from east to west across Canada. And so that's something that changed from Alberta's perspective when the oil prices crashed in 2015. And we had, 2 or 3 years worth of people leaving the province. And like you said, it's turned around. And so the numbers that are coming in they're not earth shattering. I mean, we're looking at about 4,500 people coming in per quarter over the last 3 quarters. And so it's not a massive game changer, but it's a very positive sign still. And, for a couple of reasons. First of all, there are more people coming in, and it's who tends to come in. That's the big story here.
Right.
And so we've got, generally speaking, people who move from one province to another tend to be in their 20s or early 30s. They're either looking for their first job or starting a family. And so it's bringing more people of that age range into the province is really important for a bunch of reasons. One is, and probably the most important of them, is that you have a bunch of people with new skills who are relatively young coming in, and that helps to lower the age of the population as a whole. And it means that there are more people actively working in Alberta to support the very young and the very old who are either dependent on education or who are already retired. And this is this dependency ratio idea. So this is, like I said, it's not a huge number of people, but it's a very positive sign. And that's the kind of thing we need more of in order to help combat population aging and in order to help fuel economic growth.
And how do we get more? What are those things that business leaders can do, policymakers can do to continue to attract more people to the province?
Well, I mean, historically, Alberta's been, the reason people have come to Alberta is because of
The economy.
Right.
Jobs. Alberta is, it's the gap has closed a little bit recently, but Alberta still has the highest wages of any province in the country. And so people have come here for economic opportunity. And a lot of that historically has been in the oil and gas sector. And, looking into the future, that may not be the same driver as it has been in the past, both because wages are not as high as they were. And also because, other industries are coming along, and we have all sorts of, we're on an uncertain future for how much capital investment there's going to be in the oil and gas sector in the future compared to what there's been in the past. So it's historically been economic opportunity. And so that's still the case to some degree here. We're seeing more jobs created here. But I think the other thing too, especially more recently, is that people are attracted to a place that they want to live. So there's that, and 2 components to that. One is, out recreational activities, dynamic culture and lots of things to do.
Mhm.
And then the second part of that is housing affordability, I'd say. So one of the we've seen a lot of migration out of the Toronto area in particular in the last little while, and out of Vancouver.
Mhm.
And a lot of that is because it's just too expensive to live in those places. And so Alberta offers relatively cheap housing, a relatively good lifestyle. And so I think those are drivers for there are contributing factors behind this swing.
One of the things that I've been fascinated to watch over the last number of months is just how much of a difference a strong economy makes broadly. You know, we've talked about things like migration, how a strong economy is an attractor. I think there's also evidence that it helps address some of the social challenges, even things like long-term unemployment that we've been talking about. So let's talk about the economy overall. And in Alberta, for most of the last decade, there's been a time that people have thought of with a little bit of a twinkle in their eye, and that is 2014. You know, the high watermark, the largest Alberta's economy ever was, and for what amounts to most of a decade since then, we've been below that. As of this most recent snapshot, there's signs for optimism. Are we approaching that high watermark? Are we ever even above it or going to be above it soon?
Great question. And I think that is a really important watermark that people, especially who have been here a long time, kind of hold in their minds to be the picture of a really good, strong economy. And the good news for us looking at this year is it's looking like we have, or we will have reached that high watermark as of this year. So our economy in 2022 going into 2023 will be about the size that it was actually before the oil price collapse in 2014, which is really encouraging, feels really good. It does come with a
Right.
couple of caveats.
We'll be able to say again, the Alberta economy is the largest it's ever been. Hey,
It's certainly the largest it's ever been, for sure. That's correct. But the caveat here is we have also had population growth over that time. So
right.
when we look at GDP per capita, which is sort of a proxy for individual income, will still be about 5% or about $5,000 per person short of where we were. So maybe our economy is the same value, but we're all still earning a little bit less than we would have been back then. And so I think that's where it's really incumbent upon us to still think really strongly about economic growth and productivity growth over these next few years. And so to not just sit back and think, okay, we're here, we've arrived, things are great, because
we're back to the numbers.
yeah, exactly. And so the other, thing that's, I think, really different about now versus 2014. And so that's why I say, the good news is it's not the economy of 2019. We're in definitely a stronger position, but it's not the economy of 2014 or before either. And a big part of that is actually capital investment in the oil and gas industry. So, we're seeing those same really high oil prices that we've seen before, which tends to mean a boom, and it feels like a boom in some ways. But what businesses are doing with those dollars coming in is different. They're not investing in those big scale capital projects in the way that they would have back in 2014. So that's having a very different impact on our economy, on employment, than we would have seen in 2014. Now,
Right.
the good news, I'll just add one last thing here, is I think we are seeing stronger growth beyond energy. And so I think that's one thing that's different from 2014, but in a really good way.
Well, and I was just going to ask you to put a bit of a fine point and maybe a percentage on what we're seeing or anticipating in terms of capital investment. So, prices were at similar levels in 2013 and 14 to what we're seeing now in 2022 for energy products. But what level of comparative capital investment do you think we'll see?
Yeah, so a great question. So based on some survey data out of the Bank of Canada, their expectation in the industry is they're spending about maybe 30-40% of those dollars coming in on new capital investment. So this compares with back in 2014, it would have been actually 150% of those dollars coming in. So a huge difference where we were back then versus now.
Right. So, like a third or a quarter as much comparatively speaking as we would have back then. Let's move on to talk about the number one issue on the minds of Albertans. And we know it's the number one issue because just a couple of weeks ago, Janet Brown, one of our favorite research friends, as well as our friends over at New West Public Affairs, released some polling on the top issues of concern for Albertans. And not just number one, but like number one with a bullet, almost twice any other issue was inflation. So Canadians are worked up about it. Talk to us about the picture of prices and wages right now in Canada generally and Alberta specifically.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. This is an issue that typically when people ask Canadians about what's your number one issue with the economy or in your life, the answers are almost always healthcare and education.
Yeah, or the economy and jobs.
Yeah. Those are the big three or big four. And so the issue of inflation from a sort of a public awareness and public concern standpoint has really burst on the scene in the last little while. And we've talked about inflation before, about what's happening and what's driving it. There's a combination of factors. High energy prices because of global underinvestment in capital since COVID hit. Supply chain disruptions. We've got China's zero COVID policy, which we'll probably touch on a bit more later. The war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is another, and then fiscal spending to some degree. COVID fiscal spending those factors have all been driving inflation higher, and so we're seeing, like I said before, inflation that's at rates that we haven't seen in 30 or 40 years. And yeah, it's a major concern, and I think that part of the problem, and this is one of the areas where as strong as the Alberta economy is, it's not necessarily. This is one of the little weak spots here. Is that so? Inflation in Alberta is about the same as it is every place else in Canada. The difference, though, is that our wages are not rising as fast, and so if inflation is, it doesn't even matter what inflation is in a sense. Like if inflation is 9% and wages are rising by 9%, at least
for working people.
Yeah. For working people, they're treading water. And so what we're seeing, nobody's treading water in Canada, just to be very clear, but it's close in a lot of places. And in Alberta, it's not as much. And so we're seeing wage growth, and it is starting to accelerate a bit, but wage growth in Alberta is about half of what inflation is right now. So what that means is that, on a month-to-month basis, Alberta households are having a harder time getting by.
People are feeling poor. I think that's such an important point. When you want to understand why inflation is at the absolute top of the concern list for Albertans, I think it's important to understand that Albertans are feeling inflation more than, frankly, anybody else in the country in terms of the gap between how high inflation is and how low wage growth is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, and this is the case everywhere. But as you said, especially in Alberta, a lot of the areas where the price increases are the highest are the most unavoidable kinds of purchases for Albertans too, right? So filling up your car at the gas station and buying food at the grocery store. Those are some of the some areas where inflation has been most noticeable, and those aren't exactly purchases that you can put off. And there's no substitute for food.
Right. I think this inflationary period that we're seeing just shows what a public policy conundrum inflation is, because if you think about it as a disease, the treatment, higher interest rates can make the symptoms feel worse, at least in the short run, in terms of making everyone a little bit poorer. And then the painkillers, even sending money to households that need it, well, that can make the disease worse if you do too much of it. And so it causes a real problem. So we saw this huge outsized and unexpected, one of those forbidden words in monetary policy, hike by the Bank of Canada. How's that playing out in the economy generally? How's that affecting Canadians and Albertans?
The way that the Bank of Canada slows inflation or price increases is basically by slowing consumer demand. And the one kind of pivotal way that they do that is by increasing interest rates or making it more expensive to make those big purchases. So typically we think houses, but also anything else that requires a loan or borrowing.
Sure, like a car, starting a new business, or
exactly, all those big consumer items. And so the challenge with this is finding a balance of how do they curb consumer demand, but not too much, right? Because if they do it too much and go too fast, then all of a sudden we end up in a recession. And so that's really the challenge for the Bank of Canada over the next several months, is to get that balance right. So I imagine they are having many sleepless nights, all the folks that work at Bank of Canada, because their challenge ahead is really, really not easy. The goal, though, is that prices will start to increase more slowly over time. And I think this certainly will be the case. I think Bank of Canada does have enough control over prices in our national economy that I think we will start to see this play out, which will be of, to the benefit of consumers. But, the challenge for folks who maybe recently made a big home purchase is that on the other end of that, they might see, especially if they got a variable rate mortgage, they're all of a sudden looking at higher interest rates for their home. And the big challenge in Canada in particular is our housing market is especially vulnerable. And the main reason for this in Canada versus other jurisdictions is simply because Canadians tend to buy houses that are more expensive relative to their income. So they're taking on bigger loans relative to their income, making them much more vulnerable to these rate increases than in other jurisdictions, like even just looking south to the US. So yeah, a big challenge for us certainly over the next year.
So you said the word, so now I get to say it. You said recession. Some of our,
I feel like you set her up.
some of our country's top banks, top economists are now beginning to predict at least a mild recession for Canada generally, and that would likely have some impacts on Alberta. So I got to ask you directly: are we headed for a recession, in your opinion? And if so, what's the impact going to be on Albertans?
Well, one of the biggest problems with being an economist is that people always listen to these things and then or write stuff down that you say and then hold you to it afterwards when you're
exactly
never,
that's
you're
what's
really
happening.
sure.
That's what's happening right
No,
here.
I can see this. I'm not sure whether we are in Alberta or Canada necessarily. I think that there is certainly a risk, and that risk is increasing. And I mean, in a sense, the whole reason or the whole goal behind raising interest rates is to slow economic growth to the point where inflationary pressures ease. And so that's the goal of this entire exercise is to create that. And so what the Bank of Canada is trying to do, as Alicia said, is to slow that growth and slow inflation, slow that growth so that we can get inflation under control. And ideally, they would like to not tip the country into recession. And the bank is taking an interesting approach to that by being quite aggressive on interest rate hikes early on in the hopes that that sort of starts to bend the curve on inflation as quickly as possible, so that it would prevent the need for additional future interest rate hikes.
This is the so-called soft landing, right?
You always want the soft landing, right? I mean, like nobody wants a crash and burn roller coaster kind of economy. I mean, that's what the Bank of Canada does, is try to moderate the swings. And so that's the goal here. I mean, and whether Canada is headed to recession, it depends on so many variables,
And I recognize that these things are more probabilistic than deterministic, but would you say that it is more likely or less likely that we're headed towards one?
I'd say there's a decent likelihood that we will hit that the economy will slow to the point where we might technically dip into a recession, I think. But like I said, I mean, there are so many variables involved in that. It's not just monetary policy and it's not just Canadian consumers, but it's things like what happens with the war in Ukraine. And the big one is China and China's zero COVID policy. So, China is extremely aggressive in terms of how it's trying to deal with COVID cases and try to push COVID down to zero and do whatever they can. I mean, shutting down vast chunks of the entire Chinese economy in order to achieve that goal. And that's something that we have no control over, and it can have a big impact on global demand, on whether there's a global recession. And if that happens, then there's nothing that the Bank of Canada or the federal government or anybody here can do. I mean, we're going to follow. And so there are these large external factors that could determine whether or not we hit recession or not. But I think that bottom line for me is that growth is going to slow for sure. Adding to the challenge of workers or businesses here not being able to find workers. That's another factor that plays into this. But whether we sort of dip into that into a full-on recession, I think, is a little bit less clear.
And one little follow-on there that I have is zoom in on Alberta for us, because if we look at if I try and paraphrase your very well considered answer there, I'd say that the risk of recession in Canada is probably uncomfortably high. Might be a way to put that.
Yeah. Okay.
And looking at it from an Alberta perspective, do you think we're at higher or lower risk of at least a technical recession than the rest of Canada?
I'll add one layer to that. So I think the one challenge with the Bank of Canada and the way that we address inflation nationally is we're thinking big picture across Canada, what makes sense. And so I think one of the challenges with Alberta is we've only really recently hit this hot labor market and started to see
Great
wage
point.
growth. So I think, if the Bank of Canada were to be just looking at Alberta, we probably wouldn't see the same level of rate increases that we've seen that are appropriate nationally. So I think the challenge for Alberta is we're seeing an aggressiveness at a level that probably wouldn't be appropriate just for the Alberta economy alone. That said, I think we have at least one tool in our toolbox that could be really useful for us with at least alleviating the pain of inflation. And that's the fact that resource royalties have been so dang high this year. And so that really provides us an opportunity to, target those individuals and households who have been and will be hurt the most by inflation over the next year. So I think, the one good thing is we do have a little bit of a cushion that we can maybe get a bit creative with how do we ensure that we don't leave people behind over the next year? Because I think that's really at the heart of what could make, not just a slowdown in economic growth, but really a recession painful is leaving folks behind.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of how the Alberta economy is doing relative to others, I mean, that the point about the Bank of Canada is 100% correct, and it's something that we've always struggled with in Canada, because the resource-based economies historically in one part of the country require very different monetary policy from the sort of more industrial manufacturing base elsewhere in the country. And so that's always been a juggling act and a challenge for the Bank of Canada. But here in Alberta, we are, I think, in a better position than other places in the country. First of all, employment growth has been stronger recently. It's been quite flat, actually, for the last 3 or 4 months elsewhere in the country. Commodity prices are still high. I mean, oil prices have come down a little bit. And the reason they've come down is because of markets anticipating a global recession or a global slowdown. If the global economy slows, then demand for oil typically follows. And so anticipating that, markets have driven oil prices down a little bit. And so, but they're still high by historical standards. And Alberta, of course, is obviously a huge major exporter of these goods. And so between the high commodity prices and, business confidence in the province is still relatively high. And our debt servicing costs in Alberta are a little bit better than they are in other parts of the country. So even our ability to withstand interest rate increases is a little bit better than it is elsewhere in Canada. So for all of those reasons, I'd say that we're in a better position than other provinces, for sure.
So lots of challenges ahead for us, for sure. But it definitely feels like Alberta is making a bit of a comeback.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a much better position to be in than it was 2 years ago at the beginning of COVID, or even 5 years ago at the when oil prices first crashed. I mean, there's plenty of reason to be optimistic. Inflation is a big challenge for sure.
Yes.
But we're better poised to deal with the challenges we're facing now than we were 2 or 5 years ago, for sure.
So final question to you both. What is one insight or idea you want to leave our listeners with? Alicia, I'll start with you.
Sure. I guess, just piggyback off of what Mike was kind of saying there, and that I think that Alberta is in a really strong position right now to withstand the challenges of the year and ahead and beyond. And I would even highlight a little bit more the kind of and beyond, partly because of the global conversation around food and energy, which I think has really, really shifted since before the pandemic. So I think before the pandemic, we sort of took, cheap gas and affordable food for granted in a way that we are definitely not taking for granted before. And so I think this whole new conversation around food security, food affordability, and likewise for energy really puts Alberta in a great opportunity to be a part of this conversation and a part of the solution longer term.
Totally.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'm going to piggyback on something that Alicia said 2 or 3 or about 5 minutes ago or so, and that's about the royalties in Alberta. And so one of the big stories, and one of the reasons why the Alberta economy is doing better, or why Albertans are so optimistic, or relatively speaking optimistic, is the incredible turnaround we've seen in provincial finances. So a year or 2 ago, we were looking at, or for the last year, we were looking at a deficit, I think, in the range of $18 billion. And so because of an incredible turnaround in oil prices and royalties and, all sorts of technical things involving projects reaching payout and that kind of stuff, we're suddenly hit a surplus last year and looking at a budget surplus in the double digits of billions
Right.
of
It
dollars.
might even get close to that 18 number on the other side.
It might. Like, I mean, it's certainly going to be over 10 unless there's a huge increase in spending in the next little while or prices crash, but it's looking very positive. And so I think that one of the longer term questions that we really want to be talking about here is, what do we do with that money? And so this is the perennial Alberta problem. But in this case, I don't think that we can count on these sorts of revenue windfalls this coming again. Like
Nor should we.
The typical Alberta roller coaster, right? So we have a great opportunity to think strategically about what we want to do with this money and how we might want to use it to set ourselves up for future success. And so I think that that's a big question that we need to be asking ourselves as a province in the next little while.
Mike, Alicia, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Take us through what's been happening in Alberta's economy. We'll see you both back here in October with the next update.